and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. I am Diamond, your host from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project and Magnetic Reversal News, and this is my lovely partner and co-host, Leah Shaper.
Hello.
And you are unmuted. We always have this chaotic moment just minutes before the show starts where Leah can't connect to the RB Delta, the radio channel. And it's
I can, but I can't hear it. It's like a dumb Windows problem, of course.
But we always manage to work it out in the last 60 seconds here. Now, today's episode is going to be fascinating, and it's certainly going to cover multivariate topics that are of interest to many people. The title is Ancient DNA, and what do we know? So today we're going to be talking about some of the oldest DNA ever discovered, how they discovered it, and the implications for these discoveries. Now, until very recently, the oldest DNA we knew on Earth was just pushing 1 million years old, about 1.1 million years old, and then this breakthrough came about in the last decade using a technique called eDNA, which is environmental DNA. Now, this is DNA that you're shedding off of your skin right now. It's laying on the floor. If you go outside and just pick up some soil, like every animal that's been in that region, there'll be magpie DNA and pig DNA and chicken DNA if you have a farm. But until recently, we didn't have the techniques really to sequence these small fragments of DNA and to understand what they meant. But now we do. And this is leading to whole fields new breakthroughs in paleontology. Like, I didn't have this in academia. We had nothing like this, where you could just take a sample and run it through a machine and find out all of the phylogeny. That means all the animals living on that plane. I mean, that is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely would need to be working with like a geneticist, right? Somebody who's because the technical realm of sequencing all of these DNAs is quite technical, and you would definitely need to work with somebody who knows what they're doing. But
yes,
amazing.
So these paleontology labs are now genetics labs, and they're going to bring, genetic paleontologists into the fold.
Yeah,
so it's absolutely fascinating.
But you failed to mention that this oldest DNA, this environmental DNA that we're talking about now, we're now finding it at 2 million years old.
Yeah, or older. And I think that we may find DNA 2.6 up to 3 million years old in the near future. And I'll show you why. And I believe I will prove my case. Now, how do we get preservation of DNA, and how can it be preserved this long? That's the question. Well, if it's just laying out in a field where it rains all the time, like in the low latitude, the DNA is going to break down quite rapidly because it's biological material, and it's just going to break down in the soil and become dirt. But if you freeze it, it remains pristine. And the reason why is because we're going to talk about permafrost in a minute. The first half of the show is going to be permafrost. Second half of the show will be covering the paper about this ancient DNA. Now, the DNA is being found in permafrost, which is permanently frozen ground. Once the ground is frozen for 2 years, it's considered permafrost. But we have permafrost that literally have been frozen since the beginning of the Ice Age. That's arguable. Between 3 and 2.6 million years ago is when the permafrost, the oldest permafrost that are still frozen, became frozen. That is mind-boggling.
But what's even more fascinating is that this paper that we're going to talk about, we're looking at DNA from a much warmer era where there would not have been permafrost. And the reason the DNA is preserved is because it is sticking to certain clay minerals quite well, and quartz.
Yeah. So
and that's preventing its breakdown.
Permafrost soils. First of all, let's just give you a basic definition. Permafrost is permanently frozen layer on Earth's surface. It consists of soil, gravel, and sand. and it's usually bound together by ice. In order to be permafrost, it has to remain at or below 0°C or 32 Fahrenheit for 2 years, like I said, and some of it's been frozen continuously for millions of years. Now, permafrost can be found on land and even below the ocean. So some of the Arctic Ocean floor is still permafrost because it was above sea level back in the Ice Age when sea levels were 400 feet lower. It's now been inundated by ocean water, but the Arctic Ocean at depth is like 27 degrees. It's below freezing. So the permafrost below the ocean is still frozen. That's pretty fascinating.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. And most of the permafrost is found in the Arctic region. I'm going to pull up a map here in just a second. So we find it in Greenland, in the northern U.S., in Alaska, Russia, China, and Eastern Europe. And I will share my screen. And let me know when you see the map. You see it?
I see it. Yes.
Okay. So here is the permafrost map, and we are going to be focusing on the dark purple regions. Now, the paper covers northern Greenland up here where the purple is exposed. And it also goes so far back in time at the beginning of the Ice Age when it was warmer than it is today. We're even going to talk about some fascinating breakthroughs in this first half that show that the Greenland ice sheet was once 3 degrees centigrade warmer 126,000 years ago, and it didn't melt because they have a continuous core through there and they have very high resolution temperature data. It's mind-boggling. So anything to add on this map?
No, just that the particular area that we're talking about where they pulled these samples is like, right about there. Yeah.
And it's in the Arctic Circle, so.
Yes.
So we're looking at a map looking straight down on the rotational pole of Earth that shows all the northern hemisphere and the locations of the permafrost. And the dark purple regions have continuous permafrost, over 90% coverage. This means that these are the regions where the ground could potentially have been frozen since the beginning of time. Now, some of these permafrosts, they vary in thickness. They can be as thin as a meter, and they can be as thick as right here. I found the thickest permafrost in Russia is 4,898 feet.
Wow.
Now, the interesting thing about that is this is the geothermal limit for permafrost. Can you think about what that means?
Meaning that the deeper you go, the warmer the temperatures are going to be, simply because you're reaching towards the mantle. Is that sort of what you're suggesting?
Yeah, and just like you dig underground here, it's 54 degrees. That's warm.
Right.
So up in the Arctic regions, or in Siberia here, at 5,000 feet, it's warm, and you can't make permafrost, so any deeper is warmer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty fascinating. Never knew that until I did this research.
Yeah.
So some permafrost is a few meters. Obviously, scientists are going to be looking for thick permafrosts. Mm-hmm. If they want to go look for DNA, you want it, to be preserved or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's how the preservation of permafrost began. Permafrost is a recent thing on Earth. It's only been around for about 3 million years. And prior to that, there was no permafrost until the last ice age, which is hundreds of millions of years prior. So that's an interesting and fascinating fact, that permafrost is a recent addition to Earth's biosphere.
I don't quite understand how we know that.
So this is how we know. See this dashed line here in the last 5 million years?
Yep.
When we descended more than 50% below that, that's when ice and the ice age began. And prior to that, temperatures were much warmer on Earth.
Okay.
So there was no area on Earth that was permanently frozen like today.
Yeah.
The last 3 million years is the coldest the Earth has ever been, and nobody understands that. It's hilarious, isn't it?
I have to interject here something that I found very hilarious. The first sentence of this paper that we're going to review says,
Let me guess, global warming.
Yeah, and early Pleistocene epochs 3.6 to 8 million years ago had climates resembling those forecasted under future warming. But what I found very funny is that the article that previews this paper does not mention that at all. Right? It's very inconvenient to say that it was warmer at some point than it is now.
Well, we're going to talk about this spike. Do you see this one spike right here on the graph?
Yeah.
This is called the Eemian epoch. It is 3 degrees warmer than it is today. 3 degrees C, which is a lot of Fahrenheits.
Yeah.
And we're worried about like a 1.5 degrees C is the end of the world. It's so ridiculous. And not only that, the Greenland ice core shows that Greenland didn't melt. There was still an ice cap and there was still ice building during the Eemian.
Yes.
In fact, there's a continuous Greenland ice core for a very long period of time. I think over 1 million years right now in high resolution.
And this time period that this paper talks about also mentions that the annual temperature in this area of Greenland would have been 11 to 19. Oh no, maybe that's the whole globe, but 11 to 19 C above our current values. But
yes.
But yet permafrost.
Now, the oldest permafrosts yet discovered in Siberia are only about 800,000 years old. So that means any work in Siberia looking for DNA is only going to go back 800,000 years because that's the oldest permafrost that they've discovered so far. And out of those permafrost, we've had breakthrough scientific studies where they're finding, in this case, a 24,000-year-old animal that's still alive. Take a look at that.
What is it?
It's a microorganism.
Yeah, I see that, but
it's a betyloid rotifer, which is like a microorganism that lives in a puddle. You know, when you're a kid and you get your first microscope and you look at the puddle water? But they've revived a 24,000-year-old microorganism. Look at that. And then you've heard of like the zombie viruses they're finding, like 40,000-year-old viruses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, the reason is because we're in an ice age. We have permafrost. And the areas that we have permafrost are freezing. Here's Antarctica. It's in Antarctica, in case you didn't know, it's never above 0. And people say it's going to melt. Isn't that ridiculous? The average temperature in Antarctica is minus 20 C. It almost never anywhere gets above 0, and they're telling us Antarctica is melting.
You know, I would. Can I interject with a funny here? I was watching briefly an interview that Savannah Hernandez was doing with college students, and she finds this young woman who truly believes that the world is going to end in 6 years because of global warming, but she's in college. It's like, why are you going to college then?
Well, she'll have 2 years after she graduates to make some money.
To do what?
Before the end of the world. Now, let's go up into the Arctic. And this is interesting because the Arctic gets above freezing, unlike the Antarctic. And in a lot of the places, it gets above freezing for months. And that's how the alarmists show, like up in Svalbard here. This is a Svalbard temperature graph. In the summer, when it gets 7 C, that's warm, ice melts. They show the melting snow running into the seed vault, and they claim it's the end of the world.
Right.
Yeah, this happens every summer there.
Yeah, lo and behold.
Yeah, they regret to inform the public that every summer this happens because it gets above freezing for 3 months at Svalbard.
Oh my God, the ice is caving off.
Now, what doesn't happen is the ground, the permafrost doesn't thaw. Because on top of the permafrost in areas like Svalbard, you've got frozen soil, which stays frozen for the winter and to the spring and keeps the permafrost frozen underneath, kind of like a blanket.
Yeah.
So at a certain depth, it's continuously frozen in areas like Svalbard. Now, just a side note, what would happen if the Earth catastrophically tilted 90 degrees? Would this permafrost melt?
Not immediately. It would take quite some time.
Yeah. So let's say it
You know?
stayed there for a day or so.
No, more than a day, right? Because anytime you have, a mass of ice or snow, it takes time to melt. I mean, we see this on a regular basis every spring, right? We have a pileup of snow on the north side of the building, and it takes months to fully melt, even though the temperatures are above freezing.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to go over to Greenland here. What were we? I thought I had another graph of the Arctic. I thought I had one of Greenland to show the temperature, but I do not. So Svalbard will have to do. It just proves my point that land masses in the Arctic get above freezing every summer. It's not because of global warming. It's what happens there. And so that brings us to Greenland. And a couple of things. I just put a video up on our Rumble channel called Viking Ice, which has to do with this part of the Northern Greenland Ice Program. And the scientist on there is talking about how warm it was on Greenland just 1,000 years ago, and even warmer 4,000 years ago. And 6,000 years ago, it was 2.5 degrees C warmer than today. And he concludes that it's going to be very hard to convince anyone that any of the warming we've seen since 1880 is man-made.
Right. Right, because the natural
it's the
cycle,
same.
And the natural cycle, I would argue, even outshines the kind of warming human beings would ever be able to produce if we're producing it at all, which is highly doubtful.
Yeah, so if we look at the 100,000-year scale and some of the Antarctic data here from Vostok, we're going to talk about this Eemian period right there. That is the last interglacial prior to the one we're living in, which they call the Holocene. So here's the Holocene, the last 9,000 years. And then for about 100,000 years, it was a frozen tundra, the Earth. It was the Ice Age. And then there was another interglacial where it was warm. It was, in fact, 3 degrees C warmer than today. And the Greenland ice core goes past it for tens of thousands of more years. They literally have this spot, this time, this year, this exact year, it was this high, 126,000 years ago. It was snowing on Greenland and there was ice building.
Yeah.
So all the fear mongers that everything's going to melt, there's no evidence for that in the scientific data. And that's when this paper was published. Greenland defied ancient warming. And I can't even believe that they allowed it to be printed. It's 2013.
Right.
It cost $40 to read it. Isn't that crazy?
It's always that way.
So what does that mean? If Greenland was still building ice at the warmest time in the last 200,000 years, I don't think we have a lot to worry about with CO2. How about you?
No, nor sea level rise.
Yeah,
not
so
that that's not also part of the normal natural cycle of Earth.
Well, we can just go back 400,000 here and see that there's a regularly occurring about 100,000 year cycle. But it's not exact. Like, Ben Davidson's 26,000 year cycle. These are definitely different sizes and scales.
Yes.
This is the shortest cycle. This is a little bigger. This is even larger. And the last one was even longer. So if there is a clock-like catastrophe cycle, it's right now on about 100,000 year scale. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
But that's a new development in the catastrophe cycle. Let's look at the last 5 million years. The 100,000 year catastrophe cycle has only been going on for the last million years. Prior to that, it was a 41,000 year cycle, which matches perfectly with the Milankovitch orbital perturbations of obliquity. It's 41,000 is the obliquity of Earth. And then the 100,000 year cycle matches with Milankovich's eccentricity cycle.
Right. So the real mystery here is, why does the cyclicity change? What triggers that? And that's what we don't know.
And if it is orbital perturbations or dynamics, what changed it from being the obliquity of Earth causing ice ages to being the eccentricity of the orbit? They're not related, and it's weird that it switched. Click.
Yes. Well, I mean, it certainly suggests very strongly that something significant happened in our solar system, right?
Yeah, or something changed in the mechanism that's the driver of the cycle. Like if it's
Yeah.
external, if it's galactic,
Yeah.
something shifted in the input.
Yes.
So the good news is that we don't have another major catastrophe like the Younger Dryas coming at us anytime soon. Because after an interglacial, this is the big catastrophe. The last one was 130,000 years ago. It lasted 5,000 years, where the Younger Dryas had two parts and lasted a lot longer. There's the Bowling Alarod warming right there. That was the beginning of the catastrophe. When is that? 14.9?
Yeah, some thereabouts.
Yep. And it lasted for about 4 or 5,000 years. So it's the same length. This one is the same length of time as the Younger Dryas catastrophe, which warmed Earth again.
Yeah.
So after that, what happens is a quiet descent into glacial nightmare, which takes tens of thousands of years. And then you stay frozen trying to recover. In this case, there were two glacial maximums. Both of these were probably terrible on Earth right here, 60,000 and 18,500 years ago. So we don't have another big catastrophe coming for over 100,000 years.
Well,
that's
not an ice age catastrophe anyhow.
Meaning a rapid warming and the sea levels rising, inundating everything.
Right.
But there are catastrophes in the reverse direction. Sometimes they're called Heinrich events, where huge amounts of ice wash into the ocean, shut down the circulation because they freshen it, and then it just screws up all the weather. And that's what deepens us into the ice age.
Yeah.
Kind of like the release of the Beaufort Gyre would do to the AMOC. All right. If you have any questions, please leave them below, but we're on a radio channel. So this is going to segue us into the paper, A 2 Million Year Old Ecosystem in Greenland Uncovered by Environmental DNA. In the second half, we're going to cover all the implications of what this paper says. But before we go to break, I'll just read to you a little bit about environmental DNA. And I think I covered it earlier. It probably says the same thing. Environmental DNA is organismal DNA that can be found in the environment. Yeah. And this material is usually shed by organisms, including their skin or their poop, or, you know, if you bite your fingernail and spit it out, or if you even spit, you've got some cells in your spit.
Why do they call it organismal DNA? What other kind of DNA is there?
I'm not a geneticist, so maybe it's just like in science, you know how in geology, we use big words and we could just use small words.
In this case, you could probably just eliminate the word altogether, but anyway.
It's important for the detection of invasive species because you don't even need to find them. You just sample the soil, run the test and say, oh my God, there's zebra mussels near here. So I guess that's what they're using it for. But it's also going to be a game changer for paleontology in the recent past, meaning the last few million years. And do you have any talking points about the paper before we head into break?
Not particularly. I'm sure we'll get to.
In general, these are real scientists. They're sitting on this bank here of permafrost in northern Greenland, taking samples. You can see that they've raked or removed the surface that's going to be affected by weather, and they're trying to get down to pristine material in here. And then they take a core perpendicular directly into the soil, and that's how they take the samples. They're also trying not to contaminate it with their own DNA. You can see they got Tyvek suits on.
Yes, we don't want to be inadvertently showing the existence of humans when they might not have actually been there.
Yeah. And there weren't any 2.6 million years as far as we know. But this is the picture and what we'll be talking about that they came up with. Now, this is so groundbreaking because, first of all, woolly mammoths, not a single fossil has ever been found on Greenland. And then they run this test and it's filled with woolly mammoth.
I thought it was mastodon.
Mastodon.
Yeah.
A
Related,
giant elephant.
but not the same. What?
It's a giant elephant.
It's a giant elephant, yes.
They also found hares, as you can see there, and numerous other animals. including geese.
And they did not find any carnivores, only herbivores.
That sounds like paradise.
It does. I mean, it really does. The picture that is painted, I think that this is actually very fair and accurate the way that this is rendered, because it suggests like a very lush vegetative environment with lots of things for herbivores to eat.
Oh, and there's
good timing.
Right. Yeah. We'll be right back to blow your mind. Stay tuned.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. We'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine. Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station on the internet. Please help support this station so this battle can continue forward. Revolution Radio!
There have been imaginative science fiction writers for generations.
Be evasive.
But that doesn't mean that they're telling the truth as opposed to fiction.
I'm aware of some archaeologists that have uncovered large bones indicating giants in Virginia. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, indicating that there were giants before the Nephilim.
And sons of God, plural. They weren't talking about Jesus coming down and
No, that's right. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I'm Steve Crawford. Join me every Thursday night in Studio A at 6 p.m. Eastern for Factor Theory Live. Find us on www.revolution.radio. Great guests and great stories. What do you believe?
Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show on Revolution Radio, Eastern Standard Time, every Tuesday night from 6 to 8. We talk about the four most vital things, in my view, affecting all of humanity. Number one is UFOs and aliens and their agenda for the advancement of humanity. Number two is the Jewish establishment's control over all aspects of human civilization. Number three, the truth about Adolf Hitler, how he was the opposite of what we've been told. Number four is advanced ancient global civilizations. Join me on the Brian Ruhe Show, Tuesday nights from 6 to 8 on Studio B on Revolution Radio.
Thank you for listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Any commercial advertising you may hear in this program is of the sole discretion and benefit of the host of whose program you are listening to. Revolution Radio does not endorse any commercial products, nor does it accept monetary compensation for on-air advertising of commercial products, nor will it ever. We are and shall remain 100% listener supported. Any product advertising on this program are considered used at higher risk, and Revolution Radio shall not be held liable for any claims or damages received from any product advertised within this program. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
And we're back. Crack is whack. So we're talking about this paper here, and we had a wonderful segue. Leah nailed it. A 2 million year old ecosystem in Greenland uncovered by environmental DNA. Now, the paleoclimatic records show strong polar amplification with mean annual temperatures in this region 11 to 19 degrees C above contemporary values. That's a lot.
It's quite a lot.
Now, for those that don't know, polar amplification is what the alarmists are using right now to scare you to death, where it's the Arctic is warming 4 to 5 times faster, because it's actually a phenomenon that happens when the Earth warms slightly as a whole, like we've been doing since 1880, which is the coldest time in Earth's history, 1880. And that's when we started keeping records of global warming. That's absolutely, first of all, disingenuous. What are your thoughts on that? It's the coldest ever is 1880. That's where we start records.
I mean, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, right? And so what a ridiculous supposition.
And we start the warming record at the coldest point, 1880, and say, we're all burning up. So polar amplification happens when the net change in radiation balance for the Earth produces large changes of temperature near the poles than the planetary average. So if it's just warming 0.5 degree at the equator, you can get 10 degrees up at the poles.
Sure.
That's what polar amplification is. All right, let's get to the screen. Share the screen, and let's get to the paper. So this is the beautiful setting that they found using this in eDNA. And in the paper, they say, here we report an ancient environmental DNA record describing the rich plant and animal assemblages of the Cap Copenhagen Formation. Now, the Cap Copenhagen Formation is just a named unit by a geologist. When you're the first one to describe a unit, you usually name it on the region that you're near, or a city, or after yourself, if you're an egomaniac. And so what I also want to point out is they used a series of different types of dating here. A lot of people are upset when we say things like carbon dating.
Yeah.
But in this case, they use a whole sequence of dating techniques.
Yes.
Let me move. So they're using the stratigraphy. They're using foraminifera assemblages, which are small-shelled creatures from the ocean. They are using aluminum beryllium dating. They're using molecular age. They're using magnetic polarity. So they've got lots of markers that is bringing them pretty precise to the time frame that they're at.
Yeah, and they're using the different techniques to kind of, so to speak, sort of fact check the conclusions that they come to, right? It allows them to really narrow down the time period that we're talking about here.
And they do this with carbon dating, and I don't think people understand that. And just want to bring that up really quick. They do something called radiocarbon calibration, first of all, because radiocarbon measurements are not true calendar ages. They're all starting from a supposition of 1950. That's the radiocarbon date beginning point. So you have to calibrate for that. But then they use dendrochronology, which goes back 14,000 years to find the ratio in a tree ring that matches their carbon date. And it's pretty good.
Yeah.
So the carbon dating isn't just they don't send it to a lab and get a number. They then fact check the fact checkers.
Yes.
So to speak.
Yeah.
Which is what they're doing here. Oh, where am I? I don't even, where'd the paper go? Oh, there it is. All right. So, yeah, we're right in this range here in the middle, which is pushing 2 million years. for this.
And it's like a 20,000 year window.
Yeah. And the location, we can see it right here if you're watching the video, which will be up tonight on Magnetic Reversal News on YouTube at around 8 p.m. Here is the Cap Copenhagen, right at that star there, in the Arctic Circle, very close to the rotational pole.
Mm-hmm.
And it
it's
was
also
good.
Also worth noting that they make a point of mentioning that what they're pulling at this time period is probably also essentially from different regions that would have flowed down into this area over time, like fluvial deposits. So what they're finding here is not necessarily a representation of the flora and fauna you would find at this exact spot, but that spot plus everything above it.
Yeah, so we're talking where there's miles of ice right now on the Greenland ice sheet.
Yeah.
Which means, where's the picture? If it looked like that, there probably wasn't miles of ice.
Yes.
And that brings me finally to the graph again. So it seems right here, see, this is a temperature graph they have. This is 2 million years ago. It seems that this temperature is the same temperature as it is today. Yet we have ice, a sheet of ice on Greenland. And the reason is because that ice built for millions of years when it was very cold. And it is melting because we're now as warm as it was back then, and there's still ice there. So it takes a very long time to melt an ice sheet, unless there's a catastrophe. Because prior to any ice building, even though it's the same temperature as today, it was a completely different environment. And that brings me back to the picture again. So they find all these, there's no fossil record of all these creatures. And then this brings up tons of assumptions. How did mastodons get there?
Right.
And if there are no predators, my goodness, this would have been a Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
And so many people suggest that maybe mastodons were swimming from Arctic island to Arctic island.
I mean, they could have also walked on ice sheets. They could have also been there at a time, well, maybe, I don't know, I haven't really looked at the dates, but at a time prior to Greenland breaking off of another piece of the continent.
Yeah. And why didn't things like giant cave bear or even something like a saber-toothed cat make its way over here?
Right.
If they were walking across ice, all of the fauna could make it.
Yeah.
But if they had to swim, that's definitely going to exclude large cats.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. Right. Because it is a question about, like, why are there no carnivores here? Why did they not find any evidence of carnivores? Because clearly if there's lots of herbivores, there's plenty to eat.
Yeah.
For carnivores as well.
And that brings up the question here. The 41,000 year cycle is going on back then, which means every 41,000 years at the beginning of the ice age, which is about the time we're at here, there is going to be ice building for a period of time, and then it's going to rapidly warm, like in a catastrophe, and then it'll build again, and then it'll rapidly warm, then the ice will build again. So there's multiple opportunities for animals to walk across the ice, yet no carnivore made it there. So maybe there wasn't an ice bridge to Greenland.
Right, right.
I mean, these are things you have to think about.
Yeah.
And then the other question is, if we have all this continuously frozen material up in the Arctic region and it warms so many times, I mean, how many warmings is in this graph in the last 2 million years?
Yeah.
It's literally hundreds of catastrophic warmings. How would you preserve the permafrost?
Well, and this brings up the other part of this that I really wanted to talk about. I mean, as we discussed, obviously the permafrost has some what's the right word? It has some durability in terms of dealing with warming periods, right? Because it's going to take some time for it to really melt. But they bring up this really important point in this paper that I mentioned earlier. Okay, DNA breaks down in 3 different ways. You've got mechanical shearing, which is just a fancy way of saying that it breaks. You've got microbial enzymes that'll break it down. And then you also have chemical reactions like oxidation and hydrolysis, right? But the DNA also has an electrical charge. So it has an ability to stick to certain substances that also have an electric charge. It's called adsorption, not absorption, but adsorption, meaning it's sticking to the surface. So the electrical charge is allowing it to stick, and it tends to want to stick, as they're finding here, to clay minerals. And then when it does that, it sticks to the clay minerals, it actually changes the DNA's shape to some degree, which makes it hard for microbial enzymes to recognize it. So that is allowing, so that the chemical reactions would also be hindered by the electrical charge, the electrical attraction between, let's say, a clay mineral and the DNA itself, because oxidation is also dependent on electrical charge. So the electrical charge is that space has sort of already been taken up. So that's not going to happen as easily. And then you've got the microbial enzymes are going to have a hard time recognizing the microbes. I mean, yeah, it is going to break down still. There'll still be mechanical shearing and some of these things will still happen. But there's clearly this ability for it to stick around because of these mechanisms, despite the shifts in temperature, despite the fact that maybe the permafrost by definition is always frozen, right? But
yeah.
But granted, there's going to be some places in here where things are not completely frozen, and probably all of these mechanisms will allow it to sustain through temperature shifts.
And specifically, the areas that they're finding the best DNA, and in layman's terms, all it is that these low S's and these sedimentary deposits that they're sampling, each of the particles in there is charged in one way. And a magnetic effect where literally a DNA fragment with an opposite charge is sucked in and sticks to the clast. And therein kind of giving it protection because it's attached to something. But that's permanently frozen. Go ahead. What did you say?
That's particularly going to give it protection from oxidation.
Yeah, because the charge is protected.
Right.
But then if it's frozen, obviously, they're going to be able to go back to the earliest frozen sedimentary deposits and find DNA on clays.
Yeah, and I mean, that also suggests that for like future research like this, that you really would want to try to look in areas that that have like high levels of clay minerals, but even quartz, right? Because they even talk too about how they got much less DNA from clay minerals than they did from quartz, because while the DNA also tends to want to adsorb to the quartz, they're able to get a lot more of it from the quartz, meaning it's probably not sticking as well, but it's sticking enough to create some preservation. So they're not as easily able to pull the DNA off of the clay minerals as they are quartz, let's say. But both of those substances would suggest that's where you should look, where those substances are. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe there's other substances that DNA sticks to well, but.
Yeah. Well, that leads me back to this frozen permafrost map. It's kind of interesting. I was staring at it. If you notice the line I'll draw like right here, there's little permafrost in this region. And this is for a good reason, specifically here in Scandinavia, where really, if we're just following a line on the map, see how it disappears here at this latitude?
Yeah.
It's because of the Atlantic overturning circulation driving warm air up here, which is what keeps Europe warm.
Sure.
So that's been going on for millions of years, or else we would have permafrost. This map can. I mean, you could spend hours talking about the implications of this.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about, that those kinds of like tidal patterns haven't really changed them, or ocean patterns haven't really changed much, despite everything that the Earth has been through.
They're newer and more recent and caused the permafrost to melt.
Well, that could be as well. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. But it's pretty certain that this area here by the rotational North Pole has been in the North Pole for millions of years.
Yeah.
There hasn't been much change in the land position. Unless, watch what I do here. See how I'm at the rotational pole now?
Mm-hmm.
If I slowly move the rotational pole here, it makes the permafrost map look more logical, the way it's distributed. And maybe we, like with the work of Mario Build Reps, showing that the pole positions here slowly moving, there may be a crustal slip component, minor albeit, to explain this, where the rotational pole, which is stationary, the crust has to be moving, albeit expanding Earth or some other slippage mechanism. And Lee and I tend to agree with the expanding Earth idea, that the rotational pole has moved in 3 million years about that much.
That's very interesting.
Which would then center the frozen permafrost on the original pole where it was building.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now, because the crust is sliding into the warmer zone here, it's melting at the south.
You know, a little bit off topic, but it kind of makes me wonder if that's what is effectively a small shift in rotational pole position, if that has something to do with the change in like a 41,000 year cyclicity to 100,000 year.
Yeah, so one of those slips might have been right here.
Right, something like that.
Right in the middle of the ice age, we could have had an expanding Earth period that lasted for 1,000 or 10,000. I don't know how long they last. And you can see here that it gets a little jiggy in there. See how they start to stack up here?
Yeah.
So something definitely happened to shift this from a 41 to 100,000 year cycle. And in the interim, there was some noise where the two crossed before it became very periodic. Boom, 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 boom,
yeah.
boom.
Yeah, and that's interesting because when we were looking at this graph earlier, that's exactly what I was thinking, that maybe we had a period of expansion right about when that shift happened. And I don't have a specific reason for thinking that. It's just an intuitive hit.
But then why does the clock cycle change? And what's the mechanism?
Yeah, that requires a bunch of other work that neither of us have done. So
yeah. So it's possible if the Earth every 100,000 years, if this clock cycle is a super flare from the sun or a small nova, a mini nova, but it would be a super flare, you could preserve the ice because it would be a short duration thing. If the Chan Thomas story is correct and the Earth tilts 90 degrees for a few days and then tilts back, you could preserve the ice. But albeit you would kill everything on Earth.
Yeah.
And we don't see that.
Right.
So that probably doesn't happen.
Probably not.
No. Even the mass extinction, the biggest mass extinction in the last 100,000 years is the Younger Dryas event in North America. That only killed 60% of the megafauna. 65% is a high number.
Right.
So what did the other 35% hold on to a tree?
Well, also
they would have been liquefied.
Yeah, I mean that kind of extinction would be like I don't mean like geologically instantaneous, which is actually a larger period relative to the time in which we live. That would be like within 2 days.
Yeah.
Like truly instantaneous, and that's not what you see happening.
And we would see huge deposits of mucks all over the world.
Oh yeah.
But they only talk about the mucks up in Alaska.
Right.
Which can be explained by impacts due to the platinum. We've covered that so extensively. Yeah. And yet people still say, oh, no, I'm not going to, no. It's really weird. And you've got all the permafrost up there to provide you with, the material to smash into it, to melt from an impact and to create a slurry to fill the valleys with mastodon bones.
We should maybe look at the locations of permafrost in the Antarctic, right? Because if the idea in expanding Earth is correct, that this is sort of like an orange peel effect where we're kind of expanding from the bottom, from the South Pole, then we would maybe see some evidence of that in permafrost.
Because the Antarctic continent, based on plate tectonics, 30 million years ago was slid way further north into the mid-latitudes. So one half of Antarctica might not have as much permafrost as the other half.
Right. Or you might see like chunks of permafrost appearing in sort of seemingly random places.
Yeah. Yeah. So all of Antarctica has to be permafrost right now.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. And yeah, I didn't even run
It would
into
have
any
to be dated.
data on that. So we'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
All right. What else can we glean from this paper?
Well, I'm still really mystified by the lack of carnivores that found in this environmental DNA. That is just kind of bizarre. I mean, it's even bizarre from the perspective of like environmental balance, right? Like carnivores exist for a reason. We have, mountain lions out here in Colorado because otherwise the deer and elk populations would completely overrun everything.
Yeah. Well, the ice age cycles are 41,000 years apart. I think that would be keeping the biome in check.
I was thinking about that too. Yeah, I mean, just generally the general climate is going to limit the numbers of herbivores.
And what's real interesting here is that these samples are being taken well above sea level, probably 100 feet above sea level or more. And they all represent, if you look at the stratigraphy here on the picture, they all represent marine facies.
Mm-hmm.
Which means that sea level was 100 feet higher.
Mm-hmm.
So, and in fact, prior to the last ice age, there was no ice in the Arctic, which would raise sea levels quite considerably and also raise the temperature in the Antarctic, probably causing a lot more melt there and even higher sea levels.
Mm-hmm.
But the weird thing is that even if you melt all the ice on Earth right now and do the calculations, sea level only comes up 120 feet.
Right.
So there must be some kind of isostasy going on Greenland.
Sure.
Uplift.
Yes. Yeah.
And the ice was thicker, which we know probably during the last glacial maximum, the island got pushed down, maybe hundreds of feet down, and now it's rising back up as the ice sheet is thinner than it was before.
Yeah, I think that's a very good explanation.
And the same thing is happening still in the Northeast and up in Canada. The ground is still coming up.
Mm-hmm.
It's recovering from the last ice age. All right, we can wrap it up on this crazy graph if I can find it. Oh, look, there's that bugger. What a weird. Here. All right. So this is almost like what can we glean from this? Do you see a 12,000 year clock cycle on here?
Yeah. Kind of, sort of.
I mean, maybe in here,
those
right?
peaks. Yeah, yeah.
But overall, even in between, if we just continue to try to piece it together, there are more events happening more often than less often, and certainly not a 12,000 year major cycle. The major cycle is the 100,000 plus year cycle. And the huge catastrophe that rises temperature 20 plus degrees has already happened, and it won't happen again until we go into an ice age for another 100,000 years, like every time before.
Yeah.
But the general public has been duped that somehow CO2 is going to negate this cycle that has been going on and on for millions of years.
Well, I mean, the most absurd thing about it is that those massive spikes in temperature, the 100,000 year spikes, we still don't know what causes those. I mean, we and I have talked about this a lot, specifically in regard to the Younger Dryas period and the Bowling-Allerod period.
Yeah.
So we don't know what causes that, but somehow, and that's such a huge effect, but somehow human beings are the cause of the Earth just dying and burning up. I mean, that sounds so ridiculous in context.
Yeah. I mean,
like
Homo
that we
sapiens,
don't even understand how that happens, but we think that we can do it as humans.
Homo sapiens took over the Earth right around 50,000 years ago. And we lived through the coldest 30,000 years on Earth's history ever. And then we survived the temperature rising 25 degrees C, giant comets hitting the ice sheet, creating the Carolina Bays, and we made it. No need to tilt the Earth.
No. But I mean, also this whole concept of anthropogenic global warming, it is so incredibly egocentric. Like, to think that we have that ability, that we can like outpower the sun and the other cycles of our solar system and the galaxy. It's
Well, and if you tax the public enough, the temperature will come down.
yeah.
That's so ridiculous. That's the premise we're working with still for decades. No one, just pay more taxes and the temperature will come down. Thanks for listening. It's been a blast. Pay your taxes.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.